thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Michael, for the intro. It's a little daunting to be here speaking with people who know a lot more about insurance than I do, sitting right over there. But I did have a lot of experience with insurance, and Jim and I thought we would talk about this a little bit. Socializing risk is kind of a daunting term, I will agree, but we are considering really how should government, and if so, how, really spread the risk, share the responsibility, and should it encourage, is that a good thing for government to do, and if it's doing it, how should it do it? And in particular, I think Jim will be talking about why should it be doing it in areas where the private sector actually might be perfectly competent to do it, if it desired to do that, but why should we have government involved in that? Just because I love this picture, I really had to do it for you. This is one reason why we socialize risk, because no individual can handle a hurricane by him or herself. Another one that is very timely is this photo, this graph that shows August 2008, when the economy sort of fell off the cliff. So how does government deal with socializing risk, spreading risk? There are as many different structures as you could possibly imagine. There is government-sponsored insurance, really. I mean, there's government insurance, which is something like Social Security, although you could call that a pension plan, but Medicare, Medicaid, that kind of structure. There's government-mandated and regulated insurance, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, auto insurance, at least in Massachusetts, where it's required, health insurance, at least in Massachusetts, where it's required. There's implicit government insurance in the area of catastrophes. What happens when people do not protect themselves? How does government come in? Does government come in, and how does it come in? These are post-event fundings, but people expect their government to come in. We also, of course, have learned that they come in this situation. Government comes in this situation as well. There are also forms where there is government regulated insurance, that is to say, it's mandated through the private sector. So, for example, in the insurance world, in many statutes, embedded in the statute is the requirement that that insurance meets certain standards that have been developed by the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. So the private sector has kind of inserted itself into the government requirements. There are also laws that shift obligations. So that used to be in Massachusetts a law that was named the assumption of the risk. If you did something dangerous and you got hurt, that was on you. That seemed to be kind of a brutal way of taking care of, or not taking care of people who got injured in dangerous occupations or events, skiing, bungee jumping, something like that. So we now have a system of comparative and contributory negligence. If you are partially, if you are not so careful, but somebody else is less careful, that person is going to pay more for your accident, but you're not going to recover for everything. Now, so why do we make these structures this way? Well, one issue that is embedded in all of this is a concept called moral hazard. And probably all of you have heard this term, but people struggle with what does it mean, and in fact I think if you scratched almost anybody they would come up with a different definition. But now really the definition that we use is the definition of economists. what economists talk about is moral hazard as referring to the tendency for insurance against loss to reduce the incentives for people to prevent or to minimize the cost of loss. So, for example, when we're talking about welfare reform, people are saying, well, we have to have welfare reform because if you give people income and support them, they won't go to work. Or if you say, if you provide coverage for people who get injured in the workplace, they won't be careful in the workplace. That actually works both ways. You want to make sure that that structure also makes sure that employers are careful too. But the notion is that you want to give people incentives to be careful, but you also want to enable them to cover their injuries or damage. Initially, when insurance was really developing in the modern world, it was viewed as kind of not moral itself because it was taking away personal responsibility for damages. But really the insurance industry itself did an excellent job in explaining to people that it was really actually more responsible to have insurance because you could cover the damage. If you had a fire and it actually spread to your neighbor's house, that would be covered. Life insurance was also a good thing, took care of your family if something happened to you. But I would submit that we are going back to the world where people are thinking that there should be more personal responsibility and less community and social responsibility. So for economists now, there's no sense of morality. It's really, but we really are always talking about who's going to pay for the damage and not thinking about, I would say, we don't think about now, what is the fair way to allocate these risks. So when you talk about insurance, I'm sure you all know that it's a way of spreading risk. If it's done by private insurers, you buy insurance for your home, that's your contract with your insurer. But if the government is going to be involved in this, and there's some need to compensate people, and the government's going to participate in that compensation structure, then it's going to be spread among taxpayers, and we really do need, as a policy matter, to figure out how should you allocate these risks. So there are explicit risk-taking, risk-shifting by government that you're all very familiar with. In the auto insurance world, something that Jim knows extremely well. It's required in Massachusetts. You can't register your car unless you have automobile insurance. It is written by private companies. So if you are a regular, reasonably careful driver, you will be able to purchase automobile insurance. The Division of Insurance oversees the rating systems that are used by the companies in order to make sure that they are fair and take account of the things that we as a society think are okay to take care of and not take account of the things we don't think are fair, like whether you're a wealthy person or not, or whether you live in a nice neighborhood or not, or whether you are an ethnic or a racial minority. You're not allowed to take account of those things here, at least in Massachusetts. And we also have a system that provides for insurance for people who can't otherwise get it. And all of the private insurers are responsible for participating in this. We've said, as a governmental matter, we want everybody on the road to be insured, and so we are going to make a system that provides for this. That means that all of us other drivers, unless some of you happen to be in that system, are helping to make sure that all the drivers on the road are insured. There are lots of other kinds of risk-taking, risk-shifting that I could mention. The government is involved in workers' compensation systems, are a classic example. Every employer is required to pay workers' comp. And the reason is if somebody gets hurt on the job, then they should have some income that sustains them for the period while they recover. Well, there are many moral hazard issues in here. Maybe the worker is not interested in going back to work. It's kind of nice not having to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Well, the rules provide you actually have to go to treatment and you have to go back to work when you're well. Unemployment insurance, something that you read about in the paper all the time now, is something that we look at to provide people with income sustainability while they are not working. And again, somebody might think, oh, that's pretty swell, I'm not going to go to work. But you are required to look for work while you are getting unemployment insurance. And we have, again, the implicit risk shifting that nobody really talks about until the event happens. This is the coverage for catastrophes, mostly weather-related catastrophes, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, those kinds of things, disaster responses, floods, the ice storms in western Massachusetts, that kind of thing. We say that it is a responsibility of government to help people get through these times when it's not something that the individual could protect against themselves. The financial industry is a little bit different, I would say, and I think Jim may be talking about this some. We have bailed out our banks and big financial institutions because of the huge damage that they would fall onto the community if we didn't do it. There's plenty that fell on the community anyway, but if you want to think about this, though, it's just not as simple as saying, can an individual protect him or herself from this damage or not? You really have to think about it from the point of view of who should bear the cost. It depends on, in part, on who has control of what might cause the loss before the event. So, for example, you can think in the driving example, if you drive carefully, then you can have some control over whether or not you get in an automobile accident. But you don't control the other driver, the design of the road, the design of your car, the weather, and those, so you have to think about when you're building incentives, you want to look at the driver's ability to control the loss, but you shouldn't punish them for things they can't control. Health is another example. You can have people who try to live a healthy lifestyle, but they don't control epidemics. They don't control, what was the latest one, listeria from eating cantaloupe that was grown in Colorado or something. You know, people are not able to control that risk. The second thing you really need to think about is who controls the law, the scope of the loss after the event. So once again, in the auto area, you will say, well, the insurers say you need to take your car to get it appraised. We want to make sure that what we're paying for is the damage that was done to the car in this accident. We don't want to upgrade your car for you. In some states, like this one, they can also tell you you have to go and get it fixed at a certain place, because then they can be assured that they know who's doing the work and what the quality of the work is. The workers' comp, again, example is you have to go to treatment and you're required to go back to work when you're well. And so there's an effort to control the scope of the loss. But I would say there's an additional thing that people often don't think about and don't think about enough, and that's the public loss that comes from the requiring individuals to be responsible for things that they don't have any control of. And that's the public loss. It's the loss of opportunity, it's the loss of trust, it's the loss of your morale, that sort of thing, when you are really having to carry the burden of a loss that you really didn't have any ability to control. And I think we're actually seeing a lot of that in the financial area here, where individuals are carrying a lot of loss that they could not have anticipated, they could not have been able to plan for, because the entire economy collapsed. It wasn't that they were necessarily being irresponsible themselves, it's just the economy fell out from underneath them. And I think that it's a very important part of the government's analysis and approach to managing what we call moral hazard, to make sure that you account for the social losses here that the community at large is going to experience, and that we need to think about this. We need to, as we really haven't, I think, thought about for a long time, which is what is the community's responsibility to people who are hurt, damaged, lose their income, have a loss, that we can collectively assist them to recover from without being punitive about it and making individuals be certainly individually responsible for that. So I think we have to think about systems where we allocate responsibility to people who can control the loss, to people for whom money will be a compensation. There are lots of things, lots of losses that you can't compensate for in money. Your house burns down and you had all your wedding photographs in it. No amount of money is ever going to compensate you for that. But we should be looking at who can control the loss, and also who are the people who are responsible for controlling the scope of the loss after the event. So this is it's a question of values, and it's a question of what kind of government do we want, what kind of society do we want to live in. I think a lot of you were here for Steve Nathanson's talk about where on the spectrum are we on a welfare state. But this is an issue when you talk about should we socialize, should we have individual plans for Social Security? Do you need an individual mandate for health insurance? All bound up in that is what kind of society that we want. So now I'm going to let Jim Stone talk about what is government's proper role in kind of helping us manage